Dee works on our school equipment program. Caroline is the director,
I'm not sure I will, but I'm pretty sure that
one who's more Asia focused.
Just a quick announcement, just because we have some people joining us live on our Facebook live feed. We've gone live already, but we're just waiting for a few more people to come in. But we didn't want to keep them waiting, so this is more just an announcement that we'll be starting in about 5 minutes. Okay?
And he said, why don't you double, like, right to work, right home, and right back to work in the morning? And I said, oh, get real. Can you imagine doing this? And then he said, for us, but on your way home, after why don't you take a really long walk? But, you know, yes, friendly face.
You then have to. At least you get the exercise.
Oh, tissues I might have. You will be very impressed. How about this? What is a spare? You need another visit. Yes. This is amazing. Never happened. Are you coming to dinner? You'd rather go home and have a boiled egg.
They're very related. Like one of them represents the other one has
He's over at the very top. And it's a gentle hill going home.
Yes.
Yeah. If you don't cycle, you do not know it's uphill to do. But I know it's uphill. Well, they're not, but it's very end. So that's 5 miles. When you're not in the suburbs.
Do you know the man was like and then
You know
the person sitting next to the
we got it in. Because last week we noticed that there's a got in the crenellation, if they have crenellation, but they don't have crenellation. He's an old St. John's man, he will understand. He's not
Thank you for coming and welcome to the seminar series examining the
Meaning of Learning in an Uncertain World, week 6, and we'll be dealing with the topic tonight of learning in informal contexts and in the context of early childhood development. Pleased to welcome our speakers tonight. We have a start from Professor Terezinha Nunes, who will be kicking us off. Terezinha is a psychologist, professor of education here in Oxford in the Department of Education. Works on mathematics, particularly on early thinking in mathematics, and has done a huge amount of work over the years. But as I always say to Terezinha, there's one very, very famous study that I always associate with, and that's on the mathematics of street children in Brazil, and I hope you'll be mentioning some of that work, which, although dated, is still a very seminal piece of work, and hope that she'll at least mention it in passing tonight. Then Sheila Manji, who's head of the ECD, global head for the Aga Khan Foundation, brings a huge amount of experience both in terms of the theoretical and empirical understandings of this field, but also at the sharp edge of implementation and policy design and formulation. So we're looking forward to hearing from Sheila a bit later. And very grateful to Eva Oberg, who joins us from DFID, the Department for International Development, where she's an education advisor, but works on the research team and has also as one of her areas of her portfolio early childhood development, and Eva will share with us some of the work that DFID is doing and some of the thinking, very important thinking on educational systems and where ECD sits. So thank you again for coming, and without much further ado, I'll ask Terezinha to kick us off.
Well, thank you, David, for this invitation, and thank you to the organizers. It's always great to have the opportunity to debate your work, if you can find it. Right, there it is. And I'm going to go straight into it, because time flies. Now, if this were a television show, I would ask you, what do these things have in common? Have a good look. You might not know from looking at it, but from knowing the title of this talk, you know that what they have in common is mathematics, and in this particular case, it's multiplicative reasoning. I'm going to give a brief overview of what I plan to say, just in case I don't get to the end. So, mathematical reasoning outside school involves understanding how quantities are related in the world, using numbers, which are cultural symbols, and cultural symbols are always necessary for doing mathematics. So using numbers to represent quantities, and then operating on the symbols, numerical representations or other kinds of representations, to arrive at conclusions about the world. And this is why so much mathematics is learned outside school, because mathematics is a way of understanding the world. Now, in order to have a thread going through the talk, I chose just one topic, and I will think about how multiplicative reasoning develops before school and outside school. What's multiplicative reasoning? Multiplicative reasoning is defined by the construction of a fixed ratio between two quantities. So if you have two quantities, number of pencils and price, you have a fixed ratio. Each pencil costs 5 pence. I chose these words. It's almost like a tongue twister, pencil and pence, but there it is. There are two forms of multiplicative reasoning. So in the first one, when you look at pencils in price, if you say one pencil costs 50p, so you have twice as many pencils, twice as much money, 4 times as many pencils, 4 times as much money. I'm afraid you have to learn some terminology if you don't know it. This is called scalar reasoning. We won't go into the details of why. The other way of thinking multiplicatively is to think straight about the relationship between pencils and price. So if you have one pencil, you multiply that by 0.5 and you have the price of one pencil, and any number of pencils you multiply by 0.5 and you have the price. And this is called functional reasoning. What I'm going to talk about then is how does multiplicative reasoning develop. And I'm going to make the claim that the origin of multiplicative reasoning is in the action of setting things in one-to-many correspondences. And that comes way before children are taught about multiplication in school. This reasoning then can be documented in young children, but it can also document it in adults with little or no schooling, exactly because it comes from action and not from what they're taught in school. This reasoning of one-to-many correspondences forms the basis for scalar reasoning. Functional reasoning requires a reorganization of thinking, and that's what Vygotsky would call a scientific concept that is based on a spontaneous concept, but slightly different. So it's rarely documented in individuals without schooling, but it is sometimes documented in individuals without schooling. Now, I thought we'd make this part of the talk fun. Instead of talking about mathematics, talking about people, which is my favorite subject. And I just want you to look at this child solving this problem. In each house in this street live 3 dogs. How many dogs live in the street? You can see the houses drawn, hopefully. And I think that's good.
You can point if it helps you.
So what you can see is the head goes 3 times in correspondence with each
That was
house.
absolutely brilliant. 12 dogs live in this house. And how did you figure out? I saw you were counting in a very clever way.
I did 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Yeah, you can see that he could hardly talk about functions, and he couldn't actually explain his reasoning if he didn't have the tools, the manipulatives, to explain the reasoning. Now, when I tested this child, his father was watching, through the one-way mirror, and he thought, my son is a genius, a mathematical genius, but actually about 2/3 of 5 to 6-year-olds solve this problem. And of course I didn't tell him his son wasn't a genius. I said, it's wonderful, isn't it? Now, for you to have a notion of how easy this problem is for little children, here's a similar problem in which we said in each of these hutches live 4 rabbits, and we have to take the right number of pellets to put them in the restaurant so that each rabbit has 1 pellet. And actually almost 70% of the 5-year-olds solve this, and all the 6 and 7-year-olds. Now, what's the point of showing this? They're solving it in action. You can't ask these children, what's 4 times 3? They have no idea. But they know how to reason multiplicatively, how to establish a fixed ratio between 2 kinds of quantities. Now, if you ask children to draw, the problem becomes a little bit more difficult. Of course, they draw it like this, but in fact only about between 50 and 60% of the 6-year-olds can solve this problem. So if you change the tools of thought, the kinds of signs that the children are using to represent their thinking, the difficulty of the problem changes, and that's a very difficult thing for psychologists to deal with. So that's for David's request, mathematics in the streets. So when you look at this girl, you think she's counting bananas, but of course she's counting money. She's counting the money in correspondence with the bananas. But I'm going to give you an example which is not about bananas, but it's about coconuts, because it's one of my favorite examples. So I was asking this child, the coconuts cost 35 cruzeiros each, and inflation in Brazil at that time was 2,000% a year. Something you have no inkling of. But what it means is you don't sell coconuts 2 days in a row for the same price, which means you have to calculate every day. And on this day it was 35 cruzeiros, and I said I want 10 coconuts. And look at the beauty of the structure of this child's reasoning. 3 would be 105. Can you see the correspondence between the quantities? 3 coconuts, 105 cruzeiros. With 3 more, there will be 2,010. I need 4 more, that is 315. 315 is 35 times 9, if you haven't noticed. I think it's 350. So it's the correspondence that I want to call your attention to, because it's entirely explicit in this child's reasoning. He doesn't call it one-to-many correspondence, he just does it. I would like to tell you that we have found exactly the same reasoning in India, in a market where people were selling things for 35 rupees at that particular time. So it's just nice. So just remember, the reference to the correspondences is completely explicit. Now this is another one of my photographs. I remember you, I hope you're thinking about the photographs in the beginning. And this is about 4 men in construction sites. They have to very often look at a blueprint drawing and figure out the real size of the wall, because sometimes it's not written on the drawing. And what we did in this study is we made up unusual scales. These were not scales that they knew. So if they were going to solve the problem, they had to figure out what the scale was. For you to have a sense for what the problem looked like, we would have a blueprint like this one, and as you can see, there is here the size of this wall indicated. And we'd say, actually, I want you to tell me the size of this wall. Can you do that? Now, as you can see, we didn't tell them what to do at all. But they understood that what they had to do was to set in correspondence some unit from the drawing with the meters, okay? And in this particular case, the one that we were asking them about was 15 centimeters on paper. Now, not all 4 men could do it. You're about getting used to the number 2/3 by now. 2/3 of the 4 men could do this. I have no idea why this magic number keeps coming up, but there it is. So you can see the first one who couldn't do it, and this is what he said. 9 centimeters, that's the size of the 3-meter wall in the drawing. He says 9 centimeters, 3 meters. This scale is 1 by 50. No, there would be 4 meters and a half. And then he looks at me and said, if you drew it like this, that's because it's correct. Of course, he's telling me, I don't quite trust you, but, you know, I'm going to take it for granted. And then he explains to me there are 3 types of scales, 1 by 50, 1 by 20, and 1 by 1. This one I don't know, and he gives up. So he doesn't actually go on in the problem. But the next 4 man was completely illiterate. He could actually not do what we call in Brazil, draw his name. He couldn't sign a piece of paper. He was completely illiterate. And he says, 9 centimeters, 3 meters. Remember that it's their initiative. They measure it. They know that this is what they need to do. So he measured it and said 9 centimeters, 3 meters, right. And then he says, this is easy. Why? Because it's just, you take 3 centimeters for each meter. So the other wall is 15, the wall will be 5 meters. If you haven't solved it, it's because you don't do scalar reasoning. You're there sitting there trying to do functional reasoning. Now this one is even more fun, and it's by saying illiterate foreman. So he's looking at this wall, which is 5 centimeters on paper and 2 meters in reality, and he needs to figure out that one, which is 8 centimeters on paper. And the reason I have this here is because the beauty of the correspondence reasoning is just crystal clear. So he says, on paper it's 5 centimeters, the wall is to be 2 meters. This is not a scale we usually work with. So you can see they all started out by saying, that's not what I normally do. And then he says, this one we will have to divide. I think you did this one on purpose. And he laughed, and then he said, 1 meter is worth 2.5 centimeters. Now look at the correspondence reasoning. 2 meters, 5 centimeters. 3 meters, 7.5 centimeters. But there's 5 millimeters left. And he has a pause, thinks about it, and he says, I have 2.5, this one, and he shows me the centimeters, worth 1 meter. So this 2.5 centimeters is this 5 times, 0.5, 5 times. And then he tells me, what is it that 5 times gives 1 meter? 20 centimeters. It's all done by reasoning. So he reasons it all the way out. Now, don't think for a minute that I knew this was going to come. This is what I have understood 10 years afterwards. At the time, I had no inkling what was going to come. But we were plowing on and asking, well, can the reasoning be transferred from one content to another, from one context to another? And these are fishermen, and the fishermen sell fresh fish to a middleman who salts and dries the fish, and the weight of the processed fish is proportional to the weight of the fresh fish. Now, in order to figure out whether they're being ripped off, they have to know how much the middleman, how much fish the middleman is going to have, because they know how much it's selling for. In Brazil, in the interior, means about 3,000 miles away, dried and salted. And you can actually just see the middleman doing the transaction just as they come off the boat. And let's see if you do it faster than the fisherman.
Some of the fish that's caught is dried or roasted before it's sold, and the proportion of dry weight can be estimated from the estimated weight of the catch.
E o camarão? É boa a qualidade desse camarão? Ele é bom para comer fresco ou torrado?
Ele é bom para comer torrado.
Aí tem quantos quilos?
Aí tem 7.
7. Torrado vai quebrar, vai ficar quanto?
5.
Fica 5 só? Uhum. Se eu quiser te levar 15 quilos de camarão torrado, quantos o senhor vai ter que pescar? 21? Como é que o senhor faz para saber que é 21?
Manda o trabalho da gente joga 21, ele tem que quebrar.
Tem que quebrar.
Vai pegando 21 pesos aqui, já dá 21.
Assim só dá 21. Aí quando torrar, vai dar?
Tem que quebrar.
Tem que quebrar.
Yeah, as you can see, he doesn't have any idea that this could be called mathematics. It's his work. Now, this problem wasn't actually the kind of problem they solve. The kind of problem they solve is, if I have so much fresh food, how much will it yield when it's processed? So we already asked him the problem the other way around. If you know how much processed food you want, how much do you have to fish? But there was still with the kind of product that they had. So we gave them imagined problems. And in these imagined problems, you're going to see that the relation between processed and unprocessed food is not the same. And in fact, this fisherman said to us, you know, I wouldn't be bothered to catch this kind of fish. You know, you lose too much. So you can see it's actually quite unreal to him. But that's the problem. If you, and I'm going to put it here in a diagram form. So if you, there is a shrimp that if you get 18 kilos, it produces 3 kilos of processed shrimp. If a customer wants 2 kilos, how much do you have to fish? Now this is a hard number to do like this, and you can see again the reasoning by correspondence if you follow it. I put it on a schema there, and then his was on the other side. So he says 1.5 kilos would be 9. It has to be 9 because half of 9 is of 18 is 9, and half of 3 is 1.5. The reason this is in bold is that you can see that he's aware of his reasoning process. It's quite clearly there, so he can actually explain his reasoning differently from the young children who can do the reasoning but can't explain. Now, I will go to the end of the solution, which is really quite interesting, because I want to show you the quantitative results. So if we gave them a problem, so this is another figure you had about cassava and cassava flour. So you have so much cassava, how much cassava flour can you make? That's not something they were used to doing, and the fishermen were just as apt as solving problems about cassava and cassava flour as they were about fish. Now this is going to be my last example. I think I'm just about a little bit over time. And I wanted to show this example because I want to do a little comparison between this illiterate worker in the north of Chile and British primary school children who have been taught about proportions. Isabel Soto Cornejo investigated the concepts used by workers who cut wood, as you can see here, cut it even more, and then process it to sell it as charcoal. And she was investigating the concept of volume. Now, volume is a very difficult concept because it involves multiple proportions. The length and the width are proportional to the volume if you hold depth constant. You can't vary the three at the same time to observe this proportion. So it's a multiple proportions problem. And this is how he solved it. He was completely illiterate. So the problem she posed, and she gave them a little drawing like this. This is clip art. Her drawing was better than mine. And she gave a problem like this. So how much wood can you carry in a lorry like this one in the drawing? And the lorry had the dimensions. So the worker says, first, I make a layer 1 meter high and always 5 meters long. That will give you 5 cubic meters. Do you realize he went straight to cubic meters? He knows what he's talking about. And then he says, and 2 times that, because the width is 2, that will make 10 cubic meters. Now I've got 50 centimeters 2 times. We will fill in 5 centimeters. He said it, but he meant 50. This makes 5 times 5, 25. That's 2.5 cubic meters. This is 2 times is 5 cubic meters. The total then is 10 plus 5. Can you see the similarity between his reasoning and the fisherman? So they're miles apart. I'm sure they never met, even in this very global world. But they reason exactly the same way. And the secret is one-to-many correspondence. So this is a very powerful way of reasoning. Informal is learned outside school, and we'll talk a little bit about that before I finish. And it's there, everywhere, where we have thought, where we have looked for it. Now this is the success rate of Year 5 and Year 6 students in England in the Avon longitudinal study. So it's a very large sample of children in the county of Avon when it existed. 4% of the Year 5 students solved this problem, and 14% of the Year 6 students solved this problem. Now, what can we actually learn from looking at these things? Well, multiplicative reasoning can be documented in the absence of knowledge of the procedures taught in school for solving these problems. Young children can solve these problems in action. Adults and adolescents who are engaged in some form of work also develop an understanding of these principles. They operate by doing parallel transformations in the quantities, which then keep the ratio constant. And they understand that the ratio has to be constant. They are aware of how they make these transformations. Remember, I highlighted the fisherman saying, half of this is this and half of that is that. So they are aware of this, and they are aware of the fact that these parallel transformations keep the ratio constant. Practices in different communities, in many places, show the same kind of reasoning. This is to some extent what some people might call the vengeance of Piagetian theory, the universality of the logic that is behind these procedures. And the reasoning can be generalized across contents, so it's not concrete and tied to a content as many people thought in the beginning. The trouble is that this reasoning remains largely invisible in school. This knowledge comes from the informal economy, which is also called the invisible economy, and the knowledge remains invisible. Multiplication is taught in schools differently, and actually the teaching makes no connection with the children's reasoning. Ratio and proportion are taught differently at the end of primary school or in the beginning of secondary school, and they make no connection with the children's informal reasoning. Functions could be connected to this reasoning, but it is not hard, not easy. It is very hard. We've run 2 intervention studies and found that it is very hard to make this connection. So here's the very last picture in our initial set. Maybe this is why rocket science remains impenetrable to many people, because it is not connected to the way of reasoning that they had before getting to school. So here we are, all the pictures, plus one new. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terezinha. There'll be time for questions, but if anyone has a very quick one while Sheila is setting up, then we're happy to take it. Yes, no?
We could have had a brain teaser quiz. We could have had a quiz for the class.
I know. I could have asked you what that function was for. It's for your telephone bill. There is a minimum charge, so there's a little bit, the function doesn't cross at 0, and then it's a straight line.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Terezinha. Actually, I think some of what you've laid the groundwork for actually will make sense as I get further and further along into some of the things I'd like to share today. As you know, I'm Sheila Manji. I'm with the Aga Khan Foundation. I'm the Global Head of Early Childhood Development. And it's a pleasure actually to be on this side. I've been watching the seminars with the live viewers on the other side of the camera. So it's really nice to be on this side for a change and see all of you and see who's been taking part in the seminar series. I won't talk that much about the foundation and the network because you've heard that in previous weeks, but I would like to share a little bit about the relationship between the Aga Khan Foundation and the theme today, which is early learning. Some of you will know that for about 40 years, early learning or early childhood development has been the cornerstone of our work. And many of you will know about the Madrasa Early Childhood Development Program that began in East Africa, very much born out of a response to a request that came from the leaders of those communities who felt that their children were not prepared enough to participate in a secular education, but they didn't want their children to lose out on their faith education. And so the Madrasa program was designed to respond to both of those needs, to support children's development through a combination of a faith and secular-based education. That program, which is now nearly 40 years old, has been inspiration for a lot of our work around the world and has formed the basis for how we think about early childhood development. In recent years, about 10 years ago, His Highness the Aga Khan, who's the founder and chairman of the foundation and also the network, he made early childhood development a cross-cutting priority of the entire network. So those of you who know the network, you know that we're not just about education. We're about health, we're about economic development, cultural development, universities, businesses, and his mandate and his request to all of us was think about early childhood development no matter where you are and no matter what you're doing. And that, for us, gives us an opportunity to really think about early childhood development in a very holistic way, to think about the different entry points that would allow families and children to have the optimal quality of life. In our context, we follow the international definition, which is 0 to 8 years, or conception to 8 years. What I'm going to focus on today are stories and reflections. I've been with the foundation for 8 years, working on early childhood development. And so a lot of what I'm sharing today are things that I have been observing over these last few years, conversations that I've had with teachers or with policymakers or with community leaders, with parents, and things that I feel we should be thinking about more consciously as we go forward. So I'm going to focus on the 0 to 6 span, not so much the early primary span. And I'm going to focus on two contexts, the at-home context and the at-school context. I feel that very often when we talk about early learning, we skip the home and we jump right into school. Right? We talk about school in here in the sense of pre-primary or nursery or creche or playgroup or anything where we send children away from their home into some organized space. That's usually what we think about when we think about early learning. And actually we need to be thinking much, much earlier. And the reason for that is actually the growth. We've been so fortunate that there's been such a rich evidence base over the last 50, 60 years, particularly from the neurosciences, that's really helping us understand how important those early years are. So you have this cycle here. We know that children are born with about 25% of their brain already developed, which means learning development is already happening in the womb. And we know that by the time that they are 3 years, 85% of that brain is already developed. They don't go to early learning settings until they're about 3, 4, or 5. So what's happening at home is really instrumental to what's going to happen later on in their life. We've been really fortunate to work with Red River College in Canada, who have done a lot of work to help translate the science of early child development into language, into materials that people like myself who don't have a science background can understand. And that information has really helped us grow in our understanding, to really rely on that evidence base and draw on that evidence base to really help us understand the importance of all the different environments that children come into contact with, and the importance of constantly thinking about the whole child, not just their cognitive development, but also their physical, social, and emotional development. So we talk about the home, we talk about parents as children's first teachers, and that's really our ethos, that's how we think about it. Unfortunately, most people come at this as parents don't know anything. There's often this tendency to take a deficit model approach, and that parents don't know what they're doing. Parents need to be taught, parents need to be told, parents need to be informed, and it often reinforces this message, unfortunately, which is wrong, that parents don't know how to be parents. Parents do. Parents for generations have been raising children. What they perhaps don't know is what the latest science is telling us. Perhaps they don't know that when they give their child a hug or when they sing their child to sleep, that those are actually really instrumental in that child's brain development. Those are the things they may not know, but they actually do know how to raise their children. One of the programs we've been working on for about 10 years is called Reading for Children. And the premise here is this understanding that being read to as a child is one of the strongest predictors of later academic success. We know that if you read aloud to a child, you are supporting that child's cognitive development, their language development, but you're also building skills such as motivation, curiosity, and memory. We also know from the work of Hart and Riesling and others that the more language children hear in those early years, particularly before the age of 3, the more language they're going to be able to understand and the more language they're going to be able to produce. So imagine a child who comes into an early learning environment at the age of 3 that's really had limited language input in their home compared to someone who's been hearing stories every single day, who's hearing words that the other child has not heard. They will be very different when they come into that early learning environment. So the way this program works is we work with the communities to identify spaces in the communities where books can be kept, and that might be a place of prayer, it might be someone's home, it might be a preschool, it might be an adult literacy class, it could be anything, a community savings group. It really depends on where the community wants to keep the books. And they also identify someone to be the librarian. And the librarian is instrumental because they're responsible for the book lending, but even more so, they're responsible for motivating those parents and those families to actually use the books. The second part is supplying books. We are focusing on really young children. In many of the countries that we're working in, books are not available for really young children. And if they are, they're in languages that are not spoken in those homes. Or they're stories from other contexts that have been translated for a different context. So we look at what's available, we provide what we can, and in many places we've also been involved in working with local illustrators or authors or teachers or staff, communities, to develop books from those cultures in those languages. Many people stop there. We create a library, we leave the books. We don't think that's enough. Because here it's about a behavior change. It's not about just putting the books in a room and saying, go use them. Many of the communities that we're working in are illiterate. They have never touched a book in their life, and they are fearful of picking up that book. And what we do through the last part here is a series accompanying these parents and caregivers to actually lift that book, to actually open it, to actually look at what the pictures are. You don't have to know the words on the page. You can use the pictures. You can have a conversation. And so through these different experiences, the parents start to get more confident, right? And the more confident they are, the more likely that they're going to spend time looking at those books with their children. It might be simply just having a conversation about the pictures, or it might be reading the story. It could be anything. But the point is just to create a place where an interaction is happening. And the books are used as a way to kickstart an interaction that perhaps isn't happening as often. So in our work, and before I go to the next slide, I just want to preface that the purpose of this program is not to teach the children how to read. It is absolutely not that. The premise and the objective behind this program is to create access to children's books and to create environments where parents and children can have really enjoyable opportunities, experiences together, that they enjoy spending time together, right? And that they develop this love for reading and learning. We know that books are our life when we come to school, right? Imagine coming into school and hating books, how hard that education experience is going to be. So this is about creating a positive outlook, a positive attitude to books and to learning. And you're laughing in the back because you're one of those people that came in with perhaps a not so nice attitude to books. So these are some of the things we've seen. We've been implementing this program now in over 10 countries, and we have about 100,000 families and young children that are involved in this program in one way or another around the world. And we've been very satisfied to see that, yeah, okay, we expected a change in the dynamic and the interaction between the caregiver and the child. And what's really nice to see is it's not just about mothers and children. It's fathers and children. It's grandparents and children. It's older siblings and children. It's everybody gets involved and excited about the books. So this child is now having interactions with many people in their home. In some places, kids were, you know, they say the kids were out doing things that were not useful. And now they feel like, well, we're actually spending time doing something useful. We as a family have an activity that we do together. We've seen this photo on the top right. This is from India. We noticed that in some places this oral tradition was disappearing. People weren't telling their stories anymore. People weren't doing the puppet shows anymore that they used to do. And when this program started, people started to remember these stories that they were told as a child. And they started looking at ways that they could create more language-rich environments in the community. So this is an example of a puppet show that's happening in the community that's been organized by the caregivers. We've also seen the spin-off. We've spoken about this in previous weeks. David has worked on this. This is the Read Together program in Kyrgyzstan, which is the television show that was a spin-off of the Reading for Children program. And it's also creating a different avenue, a different way for families to engage with language, with literature, and also now for schools to actually adopt this and think about this and how they go about their teaching and learning. The mothers often, fathers too, but mothers often are illiterate that are using these books. And now they feel like they have a reason to read. So they now come forward and say, will you teach me to read? This was something that wasn't of importance to them before, something they thought was not accessible to them. And now it has meaning. And because it has meaning, they now want to do it. And we know from the research that the mothers in particular, if they are able to read, if they are educated, then their children are more likely to go to school, to stay in school, finish school, and actually go on to later learning. Like I said, the objective of this program was never to teach children how to read. But we kept hearing these stories. People kept saying to us, parents and teachers, my kids are doing better in school. Right? And we said, well, there's something going on here. What's going on? So we started looking at this, and we did some studies in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and we found, actually, yes, this program, happening before children go into an early learning environment, is actually beneficial for children's language outcomes when they get into primary. And the work in Kyrgyzstan shows that that reaches well out into grade 4, which is the end of primary in Kyrgyzstan. It's, in the case of Kyrgyzstan, it was even showing that this program, which is an informal program happening before early learning happens, is actually potentially more beneficial or equally beneficial to sending a child to an early learning program. So we are now in the era of the SDGs. And those of us that have been working in early childhood development for years and long before I started, we are so happy to see finally an explicit goal that is around early childhood development in the SDGs. And it is well crafted in the sense that it talks about development, care, and education. So it's not just about one aspect of child development. It is everything. It has the potential to be everything. The indicators behind it do talk about the home environment and the early learning environment. But the part that I put in red is the part that I want to focus on here. And that is ready for primary education. This phrasing that's at the end of this goal, and this target, sorry, is problematic. And it's being interpreted in a very interesting way. A lot of the progress that we made over the last 50, 60 years that was largely driven by civil society and private actors is now going through a whole pendulum swing back to a very formal learning environment. So I'll show you what I mean. This is what it used to look like. This is when we started. Different parts of the world. I'll show you a few pictures. You've got children playing with other children. You've got them learning how to take turns, how to wait for somebody to have their turn on the slide, how to help someone who's having trouble getting up the steps. You have teachers sitting at the level of the children, children listening to other children, hearing each other's ideas, expressing their ideas. You have different kinds of experiences in the day, the teacher showing love and care for those children. You have all kinds of materials, all kinds of opportunities for children to develop their curiosity on their own, with other children or with adults. And in relation to Terezinha, what you were talking about, they bring in what they're seeing in their home environment, what's happening outside of the formal context. They're able to replicate it, to demonstrate it, to pretend play it in a formal learning environment. And we get to see that they're practicing those skills that they're seeing at home and that they're learning at home in a formal environment. I put this in the fun and learning. I put this in specifically as a reference back to Eric from Discovery Learning Alliance, who made a comment to us in an earlier week that nobody talks about fun and learning anymore. We do, right? If it's not fun, why are we there? Right? It should be fun. It has to be fun. But it also, going back to Terezinha's, it has to be meaningful. It has to be relevant. Right? We're not there just to learn arbitrary facts. If we can't use these when we leave the classroom, it's meaningless. Right? So these experiences, these opportunities, bring that connection, which is so negated so often, so many times now, that connection between what's happening outside a formal learning environment and what's happening inside a formal learning environment. They should be seamless, and they should be connected to each other. But this is what we're starting to see. So remember I talked about the last part of the target 4.2, which is ready for primary education. So these are photos I took last year. You have the Kyrgyz Republic on the left and Uganda on the right. The one on the left, this is a new program in Kyrgyzstan. The Global Partnership for Education worked with UNICEF and others to establish a national pre-primary program. And so this is a public school that has established this pre-primary class. This teacher has gone for a few days of training, and mostly what she's been taught is the curriculum. And now she's sent back to this classroom, and she's never seen an early childhood classroom. So I don't know if she was taught to put those desks like that, but they're like that, right? This one really shocked me. This is a classroom, it's a community-based preschool in Uganda that's been in existence for over 20 years. It did not look like this when it started. And I walked into this classroom, you can see the blackboard, and you may not see, but it's English on the blackboard, and you can see the benches, and I walked in and I just sort of went in shock. And the head teacher looked at me and she said, I know this is wrong, but the primary school teacher tells me that my kids need to be able to sit in desks and copy from a board. Then she's also got the parents who are saying to her, I'm sending my kids to you because I want them to read. Now this woman is dependent on the fees that the parents are paying, so she's in a sense adhering to the parents' wishes. Right? She's also, when she told me that, I looked at her and I said, why is that your problem? It's the problem of the primary school. This is a competency that they perhaps develop when they go to primary school. Why is it now your problem? Why is it something you have to deal with? But she is powerless in this situation. Right? So somebody who had a beautiful preschool before with all the age-appropriate pedagogies is now being pushed around and doing things that she wouldn't have done otherwise. So we tend to think about three things is what I keep hearing, right? Can we have the children sit in desks? Can they copy from the board? And can they read, preferably in English? Right? This is the story that we're hearing these days. In Central Asia, it tends to be Russian. That seems to be the language that they want the kids to learn, because a lot of those families and a lot of those kids will later go to Russia and work in Russia. It's not about other skills. It's about can they sit in desks? Can they copy from a board? And can they read? So does it really matter, right? You have two very contrasting learning environments. Does it really make a difference, or am I just harping about nothing, right? So the problem is, when you look at the research, we really don't know. We don't have the answers, okay? We have a few studies that we can draw on. Those of us that are child development psychologists, those of us that understand child development, we know intuitively that this is wrong. But we don't have the evidence base to influence the policymakers that are making these decisions. So some of you will know about the high-scope peri-preschool work. This is probably one of the landmark studies that was done in the US. This was a preschool that was established in the 60s, a program for very impoverished children. And the study at that time was looking at children who had gone to another type of preschool, play-based, the high-scope model, and a very traditional teacher-directed model. And like many studies around the world show the short-term benefits. They show that at the end of preschool or at the start of grade 1, children who go into programs that are child-initiated, that are more play-based, that use age-appropriate pedagogies, they do better. What we don't know is what happens years later. And so in the first one here, they actually did find out. They went back to those children when they were 40, and they found out that the 40-year-olds, the ones that had been in the play-based type programs, they were more likely to have finished school. They were less likely to have been ill. They were less likely to have been in trouble with the law. They had better paying jobs. It was showing. Okay. In the Markin is Rebecca Markin, who did some work also in the States in the late 90s and early 2000s. Again, she was looking at different types of preschools. She was looking at a preschool that had a child-initiated program, a preschool that was very teacher-directed, and a preschool that was a combination of the two. So again, finished the preschool program. The children that were in the child-initiated program, they're doing great. But these children all go into primary schools that are very direct instruction, very teacher-directed. So what happens then? What happens when you take children that have had different kinds of experiences who then go into a very didactic teacher-led experience? Initially, the ones that had been through the direct instruction experience, they did better initially. At the end of grade 5, which was the end of primary, there was no real difference academically between the children that had gone through a child-initiated program and a program that was direct instruction. But the teachers thought that the children who had gone through the child-initiated program were better socially. But they moved from grade 5 to grade 6, and the learning environment changed between grade 5 and grade 6. They went from primary to secondary, and in secondary, they're now expected to think for themselves, to take more ownership of their own learning, and that's when you started to see the difference. Those kids that had been in the child-initiated program, they did better than the children in the direct instruction on every single subject except handwriting. The kids in the direct instruction did the best on handwriting. Okay? But the kids in the child-initiated program outperformed the children in the direct instruction, but we only saw that when they went into grade 6. And that's because then the expectations on them changed. Right? So Rebecca Markin talks about how when the academic environment changes, when we're pushing an academic way of teaching, it only holds until children are in a situation where they now have to think for themselves and they have to take more responsibility for their learning. Once they're in that situation, the child-initiated program is actually what's going to get them through. This last study is of the Madrasa Early Childhood Program. It was done with Oxford University, also in the late 90s, early 2000s. Again, looking at different types of preschool models, the Madrasa supported program, other types of preschools, and children who didn't go to any preschool. Again, just like the other ones, children who had been to a preschool did better than children who had not. But children who went to a Madrasa supported preschool did better than children that went to another type of preschool. And there, the reasoning is that the nature of the learning environment, the nature of the interactions between the teacher and the children was so qualitatively different than what was happening in the other preschool that those children had better cognitive gains. These children are now young adults. We are, this year, starting the study, the follow-up study of these children to see where they are today. It'll be the first kind of study in the majority world or in the South that actually tries to understand what's the long-term benefits of these programs. We are starting in Uganda. This was done in Kenya, Uganda, and Zanzibar. We're starting in Uganda, and we would welcome collaborators of any kind to help us do this in the other countries. So here's the problem we have today. We're talking about reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's what everybody seems to care about. Everybody seems to care about English. And unfortunately, we're seeing this push down of grade 1. So curricula is being revised, or primary teachers are putting unfair expectations. And so instead of setting new competencies and new skills for that newer age group, instead of that, we are seeing what should be done in grade 1 being pushed down into a younger age group that is not developmentally ready for that kind of learning. So I ask, what about the personal qualities? 21st century skills, soft skills, non-cognitive skills, social and emotional skills. What about all of those skills? Duckworth and Yeager and others, they talk about how these are strong predictors for the later academic, the psychological, the social, the economic well-being What about play? Everybody thinks play is meaningless, but play is how people learn. Even as adults, we learn. We learn by doing, right? And for a child, learning by doing is play, right? What about the local language? What about the local culture? Why isn't that valued anymore? This image is taken from a Facebook page. It's Richard Cohen-Zed and the Art of Early Childhood Education. He posted it about a year ago this time. And when I first saw it, and I know you can't read it, it struck me and I said, this is the problem we have today. On the left, you have things like creativity, perseverance, curiosity, compassion, empathy, courage, kindness, perspective. That's list 1. And on list 2, it says ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. Right? And it asks the question, which list would you rather your child spend their time learning? And this is the problem we have right now. It's an either or. It's not both. And part of the problem is that parents and policymakers make it an either or. And they put the emphasis on list 2 rather than everything. So for me, I think this is happening because parents are continuously put in this position where they don't have a voice. Or if they have a voice, that isn't perhaps not an informed voice. Teachers are getting pressure from all sides, right? There are now policies, they have to finish their curriculum, they have to respond to the demands or the pressures from the parents, from the teachers in the primary school. They've got assessment that is all focused on cognitive skills, so we have to make sure they can pass that to go on to the next level. It's over and over and over again. And these teachers have never experienced the kinds of programs we're talking about. So it's only natural that they would teach the way that they were taught, right? We need to change how we train teachers if we want to see changes in the way that they work with the children. So for me, I think there's a few ways we can start to tackle these problems. I think we need to change the script. We need to change the message. And media is a really powerful way to do that. Right? Whether we're talking about social media or TV or radio, the Read Together program in Kyrgyzstan is doing that when it comes to reading, but even soap operas that involve families and look at how parent-child interactions are, changing what we think is normal and making it normal, right? Because what we're talking about here should be normal, and yet it's not. So changing that. Really focusing in on those stories that are untold stories that could start to become more common. And really starting to work with different types of audiences. We rely so heavily on the teacher to be that messenger, but what about the doctors? What about the athletes? What about the celebrities? And what role could they play to help us with starting to change the narrative? We need to learn by doing, and we need mentors, we need models, we need people that can go and show exactly what it is that we mean. And we need to be looking at the right questions. We need to do the longer term research, and I know everybody wants quick results and they want to find the answers now and they want to make the decisions about their programs, but we do need to continue working towards understanding what the longer term story is, both for the individuals, but also the communities that they're working in. What happens when we change the nature of the interactions between the parents and children, so like the Reading for Children program? That's transforming how families relate to each other, how families spend time with each other. How is that impacting on learning? We need to know. When we change attitudes, how does that transform behavior? How does that transform learning outcomes? We really don't have the evidence. And the evidence we have is all from the West. Right? That's where it's coming from. And that doesn't mean it makes sense for the South or for the non-West countries. So really the challenge is, how do we get the data? This is something that Fraser Mustard, who is a pioneer in early childhood development, he says that no data, no problem, no action. And we tend to say no data, no proof of impact, no influence. Right? And it doesn't have to take a lot. Caroline spoke about this on week 1. It can be basic descriptive statistics, and it can be some qualitative research alongside it, and that can change everything. We've had many different studies we've been part of that are quite small in nature, but have been pivotal in their time and have transformed because of the way they were communicated and who was involved in that study, knowing who your audience is, knowing what you're trying to do. You don't have to do the exhaustive long studies. So on the left, we have sort of the narrative as it stands today. People talk about learning happening when they can talk or when children go to school. We have this narrative of that it only happens in the classroom. And we have this philosophy that early learning means school readiness. And where we need to be moving the narrative through all these different strategies, we need to get to a point where we start saying these things on the right. Learning begins in the womb. We know that from science. That's not me saying it to be nice. It's in the science. Parents are children's first teachers. Learning happens everywhere all the time. It's happening at home, it's happening at school, it's happening everywhere. And early learning means nurturing children's curiosity about themselves and their world. Let's think about the whole child, right? Not just what they're going to be doing next year when they get into primary. I'm going to end with this. This was posted yesterday, again on that same Facebook page. And when I saw this, I thought this is so exactly how I feel and what it's trying to say. So if students leave school less curious than when they started, we have failed them. Okay? Now, I know today we're talking about early learning, but this whole seminar series is about education as a whole. And if we really want to be getting it right, we have to get it right from the beginning. Because if we don't start now, in those very first early years, what's going to happen when they go to primary? What's going to happen when they go to secondary? It's just going to keep going. So we need to be thinking about how we embrace the foundational skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, fine. We need those, but how do we move beyond that? How do we support development of knowledge, of values, of skills, of attitudes that are going to help children solve the problems that we have in the world, both today and in the future? Right? How are we going to help them create and live in a more peaceful and pluralist society? Those are the things we need to be asking ourselves. And unfortunately, with the pressures that the policymakers are feeling to respond to SDG targets, we're not asking ourselves the right questions. And we're all going to pay for it in the future. So I'm going to leave it there on a very pessimistic note.
Thank you, Sheila.
Oh, pressing the wrong thing now. A pessimistic note maybe to end on there, Sheila, but I think a really sort of powerful presentation on the value of ECD, and I think that everyone who works in this early learning or ECD space, I think fully agrees with everything you were saying there. So I'm obviously Eve Oberg, as says up here, from DFID. I work as an education advisor in the currently in the education research team in the research and evidence division in DFID, but I've also worked on education sort of programming and reform for longer periods in Burma and Ghana, and also sort of smaller projects sort of around Asia and Africa. So I will speak quite a lot today about what we're sort of doing to respond to these sort of challenges that you set out, Sheila, in DFID, but also putting on some of my reflections as well about doing programming and coming across a lot of those challenges, particularly working either very closely with governments or even for governments, as I did in Ghana, where you're really subject to a lot of those pressures that you were talking about, and you see how these situations do evolve, which seem quite counterintuitive when you all these things that we know are true about how children are learning. But I'd like to start by just sort of saying, so obviously I'm in the education research team at the moment, so I think that my colleague and who heads up our team, Rachel Hinton, was here to speak sort of earlier on in the seminar. So I think she's given you the big kind of spiel about all the work we do in the research team around trying to increase the sort of relevance, rigor and scope of education research in low and middle income countries. It's something which we were investing very little money in this sort of research. A lot of it was going to health and other sectors, but education was really underfunded. And we've made sort of really sort of, I think we're really kind of have really got a lot of momentum behind this in DFID, and are working across lots of other organisations to build this as well, because it's an area we really need a lot more. We have, I think she gave you a good presentation about where we see the evidence, where we're moving towards it, you know, what we're trying to achieve. I'm not going to run through their slides because I think there's a kind of a similar audience here, but just to say that on early learning, it's a really kind of similar situation we're facing. So a lot of the kind of same challenges we see and the responses we're taking are come from that same viewpoint. So as David said at the beginning, we'll be talking about sort of systems approach, because it does, you know, there is obviously massive linkages to seeing this as a whole system rather than just one element. But I guess I'll start with just to say I'm obviously just the respondent as well, so I'm going to try and keep this quite nice and short. But just in terms from DFID's perspective, where we see ourselves in this sort of like learning in an uncertain world, I think like everyone in this room, obviously, we see learning really as the centre of the education. And that's not saying learning, reading, writing and maths, but saying taking that much more broadly. Whenever we're talking about learning, we don't specify what that necessarily means. When we have research programs, we keep it open, and we realise that that's a mix of lots of different skills which are often needed together. We're obviously aware of this sort of turning around a learning crisis that we see in many schools, systems that we work in, where we have sort of flat or slightly marginal, or even negative learning trajectories in education systems, which are making us, come to the conclusion that, as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware of, that sort of it's not just a case of adding more inputs, providing more financing, which is, where I think a lot of, non-education experts maybe were thinking years ago. But we're trying to think about different ways to sort of look at this problem, and we think that, it's not going to be just more inputs. I think you gave some examples here about, it's not just about the books. When you give them the books and you put them in a locker, they won't use them. You have to take the extra stage, like how are they actually used? So in DFID, we're quite convinced you have to take a systems approach to really understand that, and that really underpins the research team and what we're doing. I think also reflections kind of recognition about the learning crisis in a lot of countries we see is that this is really encouraging governments to look at early learning as an opportunity to strengthen that. There's some strong evidence around the power of sort of early childhood education, pre-primary, you referenced it, the big studies. This is the kind of golden ticket out. This will help you. And I think that's also where some of this pressure that Sheila was talking about is kind of extending this downwards. So we're seeing a lot of countries, partner governments, starting to think about this and starting to roll it out, but perhaps not with having thought through it fully, and that's where we can see we can potentially step in. So what I'm going to talk about now, just briefly, I'm categorising this sort of in early learning, but also early childhood development. So they are a continuum from 0 to 8, as you were saying. I'm going to focus first of all on sort of more of a sectoral education input focus, ages 4 to 6, which is where we started as the education research team. But then we broadened out, and we're looking at a sort of whole ECD sort of holistic programme, focusing quite a lot on 0 to 3. All this research that I'm talking about is quite new, so it's sort of currently either being scoped or is being under development now. So we don't have findings or anything, but we welcome your thoughts and inputs on the kind of what we're trying to do. So this is the first area we started looking at in this field, and it was early learning. So that's kind of mainly ages 4 to 6. Education as an entry point. It's somewhere we had a lot of kind of our education advisors were asking us questions around this. Strong evidence, potential merits across context, critically quality is essential for that, the quality interactions between the children and the teachers. But what we were seeing in the programmes where we see sort of early childhood developing, or early learning rather, we were having issues around sort of scaling, equity, cost effectiveness, human capacity and workforce development, as well as integration, seeing this not just as a sort of isolated education intervention. And we have early childhood education programs in quite a few other countries, and there's quite a lot of variation from something like Ethiopia, where you've got, very sort of publicly driven kind of grade 0 rolling out KG across the country. And I think this is the graph you can see here about the ambition of the Ethiopian Ministry of Education, where they want to see their early childhood going. Massive ambition, so much commitment from the Minister of Education. Panics me slightly when you see that kind of massive scale up and you're thinking how they're going to retain quality in such a constrained system. And this is the kind of context we're working in. But also other sort of models looking at in countries like Burma, where we have community-based ECD we're working in. In Tanzania, we're working with some sort of more kind of shorter-term remedial early childhood that is looking at school readiness. So Sheila, try not to get too panicked, but just to out-of-school children, seeing if they're ready for the learning environment, if we can provide some shorter pieces of support. So given that we sort of see these challenges, and I think I've seen these as well when I've been working with governments, as I was saying, I was recently working in Burma, and there we were trying to roll out a new KG kindergarten expansion program, which is part of the national ECD policy. Governments do have a political mandate. It's a time of political change. Governments were trying to demonstrate that they were making improvements before the election. There was a lot of motion on moving forward. It's not the space for piloting, starting slowly. Lots of discussions around maybe trying to talk about teachers, how to identify them, how to select them, how to train them. They tend to get pushed out, and the conversation starts being a lot around sort of more about building classrooms and textbooks and everything. I think I saw similar things in Ghana where I developed an investment strategy on kindergarten, again with the government, and the cost kind of balloon looking at the Ministry of Finance's resource envelope. And there's some really big questions there about equity, because you're not going to provide everywhere. And obviously when you look at what was already provided in Ghana, it was very much in the urban areas. But so what our solution to this problem is a new programme that we're developing with the World Bank called the Early Learning Systems Research Programme. It's currently in 4 countries, in Pakistan and the Punjab region, Ethiopia, Tanzania and Liberia. And this is really looking at research, how to finance and deliver early learning at scale. It's embedded really strongly in sort of responding to the evidence needs of policymakers. I think like Sheila was saying, this is an issue where policymakers are under lots of pressure, so we need to provide them with the sort of an understanding of what's happening in their classrooms, what's happening in their systems, areas of innovation, other parts of their system they're maybe not aware of outside in community, views of parents and everything, but to understand what the kind of problem is and where the barriers are in the system, but also looking at the global evidence base as well, building the evidence base around this, but looking at trying to build the evidence outside of those sort of more higher income country contexts that we have. There could be potential learning across that. There's currently 2 phases of this. The first phase is system diagnostic. If any of you are aware of the kind of research on improving systems of education, RISE programme that DFID also has, it kind of borrows a little bit from this. But that first stage is really just to try and get an analytical framework together to really understand the system. And that's not a system just the education, that is parents, children, communities, schools, the Ministries of Education, the bureaucrats, trying to understand what the system looks like, how it works, where the sort of power relationships lie, where there's potential for change. It enables us to actually put in reforms that can actually be scaled. And the second stage of this is looking at evaluating reforms. So we've identified, here are some barriers, here are some potential opportunities. Can we pilot some approaches? Can we test some reforms that are embedded within that system? So we understand the local context, we understand the power relationships that are at play, and that will actually enable them to be scaled up and sustainable. But it doesn't just, we're not just going to stop at early learning. That was the first entry point we made, but obviously we're also looking now at early childhood development and that much broader holistic piece that we talked about earlier today. We're taking increasingly a cross-sectoral policy perspective in this area in DFID. Previously we worked quite sectorally, siloed, but now we have a sort of a policy kind of team working on this across health, education, WASH. We're seeing some multi-sectoral standalone ECD programmes coming up. We're also looking at some integrated delivery models where we're building on the strong sectoral support we have, but trying to bring that out to multiple outcomes. Draw on complementarities, our system strengthening approaches in maybe health or nutrition and bring them together. And also another area is looking at trying to focus on the most vulnerable through this approach, looking at maybe in conflict context, taking this kind of a lens. But challenges really do remain about trying to talk about scaling this. How to do this in systems with limited capacity, thinking about multi-sectoral programming when sector systems are really working under lots of pressure. So if it's not about maybe multi-sectoral or about integration, what would that look like in different contexts? Also, we have a lot of evidence, I think, around sort of specific interventions that we have been proven to work in a number of contexts. But they're really sort of, RCTs, which are really valuable, but they don't tell us enough about why these programmes work, how they work, which are going to be so important for translating them into new contexts, but also to scaling up, which I think is the last area, is like how to scale this whilst preserving quality. You do it in a very small way with, workforce which is very trained, maybe you have some specialists in the research team doing it. What happens then when you bring in a whole group of a workforce who don't maybe have all the, that sort of level of specialist training? How can they deliver that and preserve the quality? So we need to know more. So we're still really scoping this part of our sort of broader ECD programme. But I think these are the areas we're kind of looking at and what we think we still need to know, which is about deepening our understanding, firstly, of how sector-specific ECD interventions impact on a broader set of development indicators. Again, examples we've had here, what's so interesting is that you do a programme to look at children, the children's reading programme, and how immediately you see just the range of outcomes it's impacted on that you don't even see. And there's so many examples of ECD research where they find almost spillover effects after the fact about how it has improvements on, ECD has impacts on resilience, it has impacts on, in emergency context that people didn't see because of the stronger bonds created in the family. So I think it's about understanding how so maybe you're working it from a health perspective, but what other sort of outcomes are you impacting on? Also implementation focus. So I was just talking there about sort of understanding how these interventions are working, understanding the mechanisms of success and failure to understand how they can then be scaled and transferred. It's not just a case of doing an intervention and seeing that fidelity of implementation kind of falls down. It's like, why is that happening? How can we increase that? How can we understand the issues? Thinking about different approaches to integrated service delivery in low capacity systems. Cost effectiveness is a huge question. We have some proven interventions where we know that they work, but how much do they actually cost? How would that be? How can we make a case to the Ministry of Finance about that? And then the last area, which is sort of what you're finishing on, as well as around longer term outcomes in low and middle income countries. I think particularly in sub-Saharan Africa we have very little. Great to hear there are more examples here. But developing an understanding of, sort of, I think there's a lot of the sort of foundational research on this is from Western context, high income countries, and we really need to know more. We also need to know more about skill dynamics as well. Like how do these, which dimensions are most important? We've got some examples, some of the Young Lives research now, which is coming out in Ethiopia, Vietnam, Peru has some really interesting, and India as well, of course, some interesting examples of this, obviously a longitudinal study, but there's so much more we need to understand. We've got a lot of shorter term studies, but really trying to look at this longer piece. So I think this is an area that also we think, trying to get some data and understand how these, how child development actually happens in a lot of these contexts is really critical. So I'm going to end it there, but if you want to know more, get in touch or have any ideas, but obviously there's a discussion here as well. So I don't know if we should just close it. David?
Thank you so much. Fantastic. Thank you so much to all the speakers. We'll close open to questions, and as usual, I'll take 3 or 4 at a time. We also have online, people are online and sending the questions from there as well. But, would anyone like to ask any of the speakers? Any questions? Kathy?
I'll begin with an observation rather than a question, but maybe even turn it into a question. I think the question that Sheila began, which is how do you take teachers with very little education and who've never really seen an exciting early childhood program, but we have the way. I mean, we now have all of the media. We have wonderful kind of ways of introducing them to new ways that they might work. So, I mean, surely this is being done. Question.
Answer.
It's professional training. I'm talking about in-service professional training, which the Madrasas, which you and I know very well, do brilliantly.
Yeah.
They do it by visiting, but we don't have to visit.
No, and I think what you're leading to is the technology and the power that technology can play now, the role it can play to help us give those living examples. So certainly I've been involved in some work like that to date. It's not systematically done yet, but it can get there. It absolutely can get there. We do have the potential, thank you, to think about how to create a bank of videos, right? We've done some of that already, more for professional development of staff in the network and for the trainers. But certainly at the moment, the way that people tend to do it is still very face-to-face. I'm thinking of some work that's being done, not at early childhood, but at primary and not through us. And some of the challenges is that, well, we know connectivity and bandwidth and all of those things still exist right now, and those can be overcome. But it's how you do it in a way that then is supported by an experience where somebody gets to try and fail and learn again, right? So it's not like I sit there and I watch a video and I internalize what you're showing me on this video and I can go. It still needs to be supported with a process that is face-to-face, that helps you understand what you're seeing, why you're seeing what you're seeing, what to do with that, when it works, when it doesn't work. So I think this idea of a blended approach where we can use some technology, whether it's in a face-to-face setting or some distant setting, complemented by more of the mentoring and more of the in-classroom support. That'll be great. That would be the way to go.
But I think that's really important, because exactly, I'm not sure you're suggesting it's me the full complement of the teacher training program, but just to get that, to see it, to understand, to kind of create that shift. And I think that in a lot of teacher training programs where there are elements of videos, they've actually been the most successful, and they're often the element that I think teacher trainees find, can find the most valuable. So I think very much that sort of behaviour change, I think, is a really exciting opportunity.
And we have a few questions from those who are watching abroad, one of which is from Manji, who asks, what is the importance of native language in early learning? Should I list the other ones? They're a little... Sure. Okay. Then another one is from Wakil Bekri, which says, they say many parents in my context think that play is a waste of time for their children. We conducted sessions on the importance of play and what children learn from each play. But what are the other possible strategies to support them understanding the importance of play? And then the next question is from Andy Cunningham, who asks, what recommendations do panelists have for improving quality education in lower and upper primary education after ECD years, bringing insights from the early learning years, i.e. the critical role of play, love of reading, parental engagement, and the drive for making learning fun into the later learning years?
And also, can we just point out, there's been a ton of discussion online.
Thanks, Andy.
Well, no, there's been a lot of people from different countries that have come in, so we'll send those to you as well, just so you can see some of the discussion that's gone on.
Thank you. I thank our online viewers. I still have no idea how we do it, but it's wonderful. Thank you.
So Najib and Wakil are actually colleagues of ours based in Afghanistan. And so, hello to both of you. I can offer an opinion, and I'd welcome opinions from my colleagues on the panel. So Najib, you asked about the role of mother tongue and why that's so important. I think we know the evidence. The evidence says that children need to learn their own language first, not just because the language matters, but because communication matters. And we learn language so we can be able to communicate and make meaning of our world. And if we're doing it in a language that's foreign to us, then our experiences are diluted, right? So ultimately, the value in learning that first language comes from the value in that child developing a sense of identity and that child being able to express him or herself freely in his community. It does not mean that you can't introduce other languages. This by no means means that. But it's about valuing where that child is coming from. And we know for any kind of early childhood approaches, you start with what the child can do. You start with what the child knows, and you build out from there. So children know their language, right? And you use that as a means to build and extend and broaden out.
Can I add something to that? Because, one of the questions I had today with the value of play. And one of the things that is really quite important for early childhood education, and I'm talking more generally, whatever age, is to see the invisible learning that I was talking about. There is an awful lot of learning in play, but people don't see it. Because they think of it as play, in the same way that the fisherman said, this is just my work. So he doesn't see it as mathematics. And one of the things that we find very powerful when we are working with teachers is to get them to see the learning that they didn't see before. And you pointed out in your response to Kathy that looking at things doesn't mean that you're actually seeing things. You need to learn to see things. So all these things are very important in teacher education and value on some aspects of children's experiences that we don't value normally.
I think that's also the case of experiencing that type of learning yourself as a teacher as well. If you get training with the pedagogy that it much, with an experiential fun, and it's true, like fun is still an important part of learning. And if you get to internalise that and experience yourself how enjoyable that is and how it aids your learning, it can sort of support how you learn, how you understand the importance of that in the classroom. Yeah, I don't know if I should may add a comment on the Andy's really small question, which I think was, how do you improve quality at primary and upper primary level? He did then qualify a little bit with on sort of the learning, but I mean, I think that was something that, you know, sort of, don't have all the answer to that today, but I think what's really important about that question is that is some of the reason why there's that pressure downwards as well, is that, of course, you have to address this at higher levels of the system. Because like you say, if teachers are saying, well, all they're doing is sitting and copying the board, then, you know, there's no point, it's not the point, it can be, you know, there's less motivation for the children or the teachers to develop those skills. If they're not then going to use them, it may make them, less suitable to that kind of environment. So it's definitely about looking up the system and seeing this as something, a change we have to make throughout the whole system. And I think that's the challenge we have, is that in many of the countries that we work in, for example, there's such a didactic sort of pedagogy that's why it's so hard to make this change at the early level. But that's why it has to be brought in, I think, together. It's not something, this is just for small children. It's not just about play. It's about couching that in sort of this is how we learn. It's even more important here for all the reasons we've been talking about, but also to sort of say, actually, you know, this should be kind of coming up through the whole of your system. It's not just something around the early years.
Yeah, I think, you know, going back to the comment around play, there's this association that play is for children, and it only happens in those early years. And I think some of the challenge is the way people define play. People associate play with playing on the swings or playing on the slide or playing with sand or playing with water or playing games, and that's all they think is play. But children building a tower out of materials is also play. Children dramatizing something that's happening at home is also play. And so some of it, I think, is how people interpret that word, and they give it less value simply because of the meaning they associate it with it. But as we go older, into the older years, play isn't necessarily going to look exactly the same way. It's going to evolve, it's going to change. Play at a higher grade might be around solving a problem in the real world, right? The fisherman that we've talked about today. That is play. We don't call it play, but it is play in the most abstract, broad sense. It is still play. It's basically anything that is different from what is happening when the child is sitting at a desk and facing a board and being told how to think and how to work, right? And I think Andy's comment is really about how do we spread that ethos of play across the system and not just keep it at that early year. How do we push up rather than allow this push down that keeps happening? And we've had so many stories over the years of children that have transitioned from one of these lovely, beautiful programs into a very dry and boring primary school, and who have gone running back to the preschool and say, I won't go there. I won't go to that primary school. Right? So you do have to think about the contrast, right, in the learning environment that's happening at one stage and then the next stage, and how dramatically different they are, and think about how we bring the two together. So it's that continuum, right, that goes from the beginning, from the home into that early learning environment and all the way up. So some ways that we've been able to get around that is bringing the primary school teachers to the early learning, whatever that's called in that context, to come participate, to be part of that, right? Or bring the head teachers and bring them to be part of that. And it goes back to what we were saying before about the experiential learning, right? It's not just about be the observer and see it happen. It's actually live it, do it, feel it, get excited about it, and then reflect on why it's important, you know, what you're getting out of that.
Thanks very much, Sheila. Thanks, all speakers. I'll bring this to a close. Just perhaps I'll summarise in a minute, but I think on the word play, just in case people think that even Oxford academics sort of sit behind their musty old desks or musty old bookcases, we tend to think that we play with ideas and play with concepts, and that really is a very important way of thinking about intellectual activity. But to summarise, I hope I do the speakers justice, and certainly starting with Terezinha, I think one of the important lessons for us, certainly for me, is that there is evidence of higher order cognitive ability of reasoning and thinking in out-of-school contexts. And what Terezinha also makes really clear is that we have ways of knowing and ways of understanding the context in which learning takes place, what it is, and how it is defined, and long may that sort of multi and interdisciplinary approach with anthropologists, cognitive psychologists, development psychologists, who think about the ecological validity of cognition in culture. That is really important for our seminar series. We've also learned that culture and context is inextricably intertwined with cognition. And that is very important. That is culture and context that makes cognition. That learning is mediated by activity like fishing, like selling sweets or coconuts, and by context, including an understanding of the economic or political pressures of the time, inflation and so on. I thought that was really very important. It's also clear from not only Terezinha's paper, but from both Sheila and Eva, that one of the persistent difficulties for schooling is its inability, and some might argue its reluctance, to draw from the context of learning what we know about learning and the meaning of learning into the school curriculum. And I think it is a persistent difficulty, and unless we do something about trying to accommodate other learning systems, other understandings of learning into the formal system, it will remain bereft and problematic. It's clear from Sheila's presentation that learning is, in a sense, mediated culturally. It's mediated by tools. We see that books, for example, provide a cultural resource for interaction between parents and children, and that books as a cultural resource can be used to instigate social interaction. So, this calls, there's a very important point about the introduction of such a cultural resource doesn't have only one potential outcome, but social interaction, fun, enjoyment, a basis for dialogue, much as having supper together or watching a film together would have, is really important. And the consequences of this for learning, I think, are really, really important. That what learning is and what it means, I think Sheila was saying, as becoming sadly more narrowly defined, and I think her challenge is for us to try and roll this back. And lastly, from Eva, a really important question about how one puts early childhood development, but also learning more broadly in education, at the heart of systems and at the heart of communities. How do we scale this up? How do we bring these broader understandings to bear on formal systems that sometimes seem really reluctant and resistant to change? I think it's been a phenomenal series and set of presentations. I thank all the speakers for coming, and I invite you to join me in thanking them in the traditional way. Wine, orange juice and water at the back, and a chance